Okay, here we go with the last section of chapter 37. And section 4 is about the aftermath of World War II. And the section is titled Neither Peace Nor War. And that describes the climate following the end of World War II. The war is over, so there's no war, but the situation can hardly be described as peaceful. What happens after the war sets the stage for a series of tensions that is going to last from 1945 to about 1992. And we still live with the mindsets of the Cold War. So this terminology, the fear of communism, still play a big part in politics here in the United States today. And so the reason for the beginning of the tension is the unlikely alliance in the war between the US, the British, and the Soviet Union. So pictured here, we see in the first photograph, Winston Churchill, which was the Prime Minister of England, President Harry Truman of the United States, and Joseph Stalin, Premier of the Soviet Union, or General Secretary of the Soviet Union. And in the second picture, we see Churchill again, only it's Roosevelt in the picture, and Stalin. So when the war starts, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the President of the United States, and he is in his third term. And towards the end of the war, he dies. And he dies in office during the war, and President Harry Truman, or Vice President Harry Truman, becomes the president towards the end of the war. And these two photographs are taken at two of the conferences at Yalta and at Potsdam. And so it was at these conferences towards the end of the war that we begin to see a rift developing between the United States and Britain with the Soviet Union. And so what happens at the end of the war is we see the emergence of two superpowers. By the end of World War II, the British, the French, the Germans, they are all weakened. Their empires have begun to collapse. They are going to lose their overseas territories within the following decades. And there were two countries left really in a place of global hegemony, the United States and the Soviet Union. But opposing post-war goals, opposing economic systems, and competition for influence over the non-aligned countries ignite a new tension called the Cold War. It's called a Cold War because it's not a belligerent war. It's not a war with firepower. It's an ideological war. It's a series of tensions. It's cold. But it will manifest itself in different conflicts throughout the 50s and 60s, 70s, and 80s. So to understand the end of World War II, right, the human cost of this war was higher than any other war before. At least 60 million people died because of the war. The Soviet Union and China suffered the highest losses. 8 million Germans fled to escape the Soviet army. 12 million Germans were taken prisoners, and Soviets were taken prisoners of war. And then camp survivors from the concentration camps returned home after the war. If you take a look at the pie chart comparing World War I and World War II, right, of war casualties, a casualty is somebody killed, injured, or taken prisoner, or missing in action. 86% of casualties in World War I were military related, only 14 were civilian related. World War II, 54% of the casualties are on innocent civilians, non-combatants, right? Which I mentioned in the previous lecture about how civilians became more targeted in this war than previous wars, and that's a development you should understand and be familiar with. The Soviet Union lost 11 million soldiers and then 6.7 million civilians. So you could use that chart, and reference that chart of the number of deaths. Right? This chart here shows you in the countries how many military deaths versus civilian deaths. The red bars are military deaths. The green bars are civilian deaths. And then the blue is the total deaths as percentage of the population. So you can see the high numbers in China with the Japanese actions, and you can see in China that the majority of those deaths are civilian deaths. And you look at places like Poland, Indonesia, right? Those are places where Japan occupied. You look at Lithuania, I'm sorry, not Lithuania. You look at Yugoslavia, right? You could see there's more civilians, French Indochina, right? On the side of the Germans, you see not as much civilians compared to military. So just again, understand that civilians became much more targeted in this war. So it also changes the nature of how we should deal with war, and it influences the conferences that are going to take place at the end of the war. So the period following World War II is known as the Cold War. The Soviets had entered into an unlikely alliance after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. The Soviets, though, throughout the war had a lot of disagreements in how the war was carried out. The Soviet Union, like you saw in the earlier charts, lost 11 million soldiers, over 6 million civilians. From 1941 to 43, they're being slaughtered by the German army. And Stalin had been asking the US and the British to invade Europe, invade France, to do what happened in World War I, which is to split the German army into an Eastern Front and Western Front. Right? Russia's getting pummeled, and they want the Allies to open up another front to invade Normandy, and that was delayed until 1944. So the Soviets resented US-British delays to launch the Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. They felt that if they had done that earlier, more Russian lives would have been saved. The United States and Britain resented Stalin's pact with Hitler. They felt that if Stalin would have seen this coming early on, he could have formed an alliance and they could have stopped Hitler earlier, but instead he was tricked into signing a non-aggression pact. So there was bitterness on both sides. And there was, there had been tensions dating back to World War I between the Russians and the Allies as well, going back to the Russian Civil War. And then just the ideology of communism versus capitalism. So at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, so first was Yalta, and at the Yalta conference, they meet to decide what is going to happen with Germany and what's going to happen. Stalin wants the areas that the Soviets liberate to be under his control. Churchill and Roosevelt, they want the areas to be democratic, to let them choose how they want to be governed, right? So what they come to as an agreement at Potsdam and at Yalta is that each power will occupy and control the areas they liberate. So if your army drives the Nazis out of a particular region or country, then your army has the right to control that area and occupy it. Now, they say, for the public eye, they say that you control it until those people could democratically choose their own government. But Churchill knew Stalin doesn't plan to have free elections, right? So he's saying one thing in public, but in reality, he's letting Stalin know, look, yeah, okay, that's fair, right? So behind the scenes, Churchill's telling Stalin, I'm going to say I want free elections, but I know in reality you're going to do what you're going to do, and we're going to do what we're going to do. So they agreed to partition Germany into zones of occupation. So you can see the map here. Germany gets divided into a Soviet zone, a French zone, a British zone, and an American zone to be occupied and denazified. So these countries will occupy Germany in 4 sections. The Soviet Union had the bigger chunk because they got to Berlin first. And so this also becomes a race. At the end of the war, they are racing to try to get to Berlin because they know by the time they're racing towards the end of the war, the Allies know that whoever gets to Berlin first is going to call the shots, right? So Stalin is putting a lot of pressure on his army, on the Red Army, to make sure that they get to Berlin before the Americans and the British do, because he wants to be able to control the fate of Germany. And actually, this map is not Germany. That map is of Berlin. So Germany looks a little different, but it's the same kind of breakup where Germany gets divided. But so does the city of Berlin. The city of Berlin also becomes divided. It's the capital city. And it's in the East German sector. And that's going to play a role later on as the tensions of the Cold War grow. So post-territorial tensions reflected a growing schism between the communist world and the capitalist world. The communist world was serving the needs of the Soviet Union, and with the command economy, the countries in the East didn't really have independence. They had to play by Russia's rules, whereas the West, they had more democracy, more democratic governments, and capitalism. So the Soviets take East Germany, and Berlin is divided into four. Churchill begins to speak of an Iron Curtain, right? Churchill's rhetoric talks about this Iron Curtain descending on Europe, from Trieste in the Adriatic to Stettin in the Baltic, right? And you could see here on this map, there's a little white line between the red and the blue, okay? And that becomes known as the Iron Curtain. It's not a physical barrier, it's an imaginary border between countries that were communist and on the side of the Soviets, and countries that were capitalist and on the side of the United States during the Cold War. The key is wrong. The blue should be the Western Bloc, and the red should be the Eastern Bloc. Now you'll notice, if you look closely, Yugoslavia is red and Albania is red, right? But you'll notice Yugoslavia is on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The people of Yugoslavia liberated themselves from the Nazis. They fought the Nazis and drove them off before the Soviets got there. And since they liberated themselves, they don't have to do what Stalin wants. Okay? Marshal Tito, or Josip Broz, was the leader, the communist leader of Yugoslavia, and he resisted becoming a puppet of Stalin. So he had a communist country, so the country is communist, but it's not playing by the same rules as Stalin. They take kind of a more independent approach to communism, as long as Tito was alive. And then Korea is also divided at the 38th parallel, which is the line on the map. Half of Korea was going to be occupied by the Soviets and half by the Americans, okay, until they could, restore the government of North Korea. So following the war, the war ends in 1945. By 1947, the United States had pledged people that were free people resisting subjugation, which really meant if your country is trying to become communist and you don't want to, we will help you. If Stalin is trying to influence your people, we will stop him. And that became known as the Truman Doctrine. And the goal of the Truman Doctrine was to keep communism from spreading any further than it had. It had already spread to the Eastern European countries that you saw on the previous map, right? Places like Hungary, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, because those are the areas where the Soviet army was driving the Nazis out of. So the countries east of Germany were under Stalin's influence. So this policy became known as containment, and it shifted the U.S. from a country of isolationists to a country of interventionists. Right? Before the war, it was, we don't want to get involved in anybody's problems. And after the war, it's like, we're going to get involved in everybody's problems if it deals with the spread of communism. And Turkey and Greece are the first to be aided because especially in Greece, there was a big movement towards becoming communist. So they supported the Greeks, which weren't necessarily Democrat. The Greek government that was actually fighting the communists was very, very right-wing and very Nazi sympathetic, but they weren't communist, and that's going to become key in the Cold War. In 1948, the United States issues the Marshall Plan, named after the Secretary of State, George Marshall. 1948, the Marshall Plan, known as the European Recovery Program, was an aid package to European countries to rebuild after the war and to strengthen capitalism. And the caveat was, if you received Marshall aid money, you had to purchase American-made goods. So this was a way of getting countries, one, you want them to recover. They didn't want what happened after World War I to occur, where countries have weak economies, and remember those weak economies led to the rise of fascist dictators like Mussolini, like Hitler. They want to avoid that, and they want to make the world strong for capitalism and for democratic governments, so they are going to loan money to these countries. But you have to purchase from American companies. And the goal was to stimulate the American economy, right? And so countries like Switzerland and Sweden, Italy, France, Germany, or at least the western part of Germany, Britain, are taking advantage of this aid. And they offered it to every country. They offered it to Eastern European countries too, but those European countries were under the control of the Soviet Union, and the people in charge of those countries were either communists allied with the Soviets or puppets of the Soviets, or they were being intimidated by the Soviets. And so the Soviet Union put together its own economic aid package, Comecon, not the convention you have in San Diego with comic books. Okay, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And that was the Soviets' response to the Marshall Plan, and it applied to the Soviet satellite nations of Eastern Europe. So you want to become familiar with that term, satellite nations. And they're called satellites because they're controlled from afar, right? Moscow is in the Soviet Union, but Moscow is going to call the shots in Yugoslavia, or not Yugoslavia, in Romania, okay, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Poland, right? And later on, it's going to form allies in Cuba, in East Germany, in Bulgaria. And so that's the response. In 1949, the United States creates a military alliance to defend each other in case there's ever a war. It's a mutual defense treaty called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it's a regional military alliance against Soviet aggression. So to protect from the Soviet Union's ever doing anything, they formed this massive alliance that includes the United States, Canada, and then the countries in Northern Europe on the Atlantic, right? The United Kingdom, Iceland, Spain, Portugal, France, Norway. And then over time, more countries get added. So this was a way of letting the Soviet Union know, look, you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. So the Soviet Union responds in 1955 by creating its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And that's their response to NATO. And the goal of both superpowers was to protect their hegemony within their alliance. So the Soviet Union is not trying to gain more allies, it's trying to make sure that these countries stay within the Soviet sphere. Not all the post-war developments were this tense, though. The Soviets and the Americans cooperated to maintain international peace and security temporarily when they created the United Nations. So in 1945, the UN, the United Nations, was created. And this one, unlike the League of Nations, includes a Security Council. So NATO has the ability to send troops, and countries have to give, each country has to give a certain amount of troops. However, what makes NATO not as effective is tensions within the superpowers still. There are 5 permanent members on the Security Council. There are 13 members, I believe. 5 of them are permanent. The rest of them rotate every year. But both the United States and Russia are permanent members. And that means that if Russia doesn't want to go along with the decision, or if the United States doesn't want to go along with the decision, then nothing could get done, because they both have, the 5 permanent members have veto power. They could veto decisions. So if they say, hey, we're going to go stop this war as a UN, Russia could be like, no, that's our ally, like as is in the case with Syria or with, doing things to Iran. The war in Afghanistan was hard for the U.S. to get the UN to get involved because other members of the Security Council are like, no, that's not a justification for war. So it's also got its weaknesses. So to summarize this section, the policy of appeasement, letting Hitler get away with his aggression, hoping to avoid war, and the U.S. policy of isolationism, of kind of like staying at a distance, allowed the Axis powers and the aggressors to gain strength. This is used a lot today to justify, the war in Iraq that happened after 9/11. A lot of the rhetoric behind stopping Saddam Hussein, a lot of people use this rhetoric saying, if Hitler would have been stopped when he was weak, this war would have been avoided. We can't let Saddam Hussein get powerful. So, right, that's not always a very good comparison. And in that case, it was not a very good comparison. But in people's minds, that's still a strong argument for sending military into countries and starting a war, saying, we got to start a war with this country while it's weak so that it doesn't get strong and then threaten us later. Like World War I, World War II was a total war, right? It involved civilians, it involved the domestic economies. The atrocities committed by the occupying forces and the genocide in Europe saw a much larger death toll among the civilians. It devastated Europe and Asia. And then the post-war period sets the stage for the Cold War. And we're going to learn more about the Cold War in chapter 38. Okay, so that is it for this chapter. Make sure that you have your processing guides complete. And I hope this helped clarify anything. If there's any questions, just always remember you can ask in class. Have a good one.